Hello everyone. Today I want to show a wonderful game played in 1907 between Frank Marshall and Emanuel Lasker in their World Championship fight. Let's check it out. Marshall starts with e4. We have e5, knight f3, and knight c6. Bishop b5, the Royal Lopez, and knight f6, the Berlin defense. d4, striking in the center immediately. E takes d4, and white castles. We'll grab the pawn later. Bishop e7, e5, knight e4, and knight into d4. Black castles and knight f5, d5, striking in the center, a very principled idea. Bishop into c6 first, b into c6, knight into e7, and queen into e7. So some captures. Rook e1, queen h4 from Lasker, and bishop e3 defending f2. f6 and f3 attacking the knight. And while knight g5 was a perfectly good alternative, Lasker chose to go with f into e5. He gives up a piece. And after f into e4, he plays d4. He's opened the f file for attack. The queen on h4 is quite active. The e4 pawn is vulnerable. And here, Marshall blinked. He could. The immediate bishop d2 is not very strong. He played bishop because you can have bishop g4, queen c1, and then rook f2. Very active place for the rook. Bishop to g5, trying to dislodge the queen, but rook into g2. King into g2 and bishop h3 check. King h1 and queen f2, and we see that white is in huge trouble here. Queen g2 is a threat, queen f3 is a threat. So after d4, first g3, hitting the queen, queen to f6, keeping pressure on down the f file, and bishop into d4. Here bishop d2 was actually fine because black has nothing more than a draw. Queen f2 check, king h1, and bishop h3. There is rook g1 first. And while black has a wonderful move in bishop f1, trying to reroute the bishop to e2, there is bishop e1, hitting the queen first, not giving black enough time. Queen e3 and knight d2, covering f3 also. So after bishop e2 and queen c1, bishop f3, simply knight into f3. Queen into f3 and rook g2, queen f1 check, and black would have a perpetual, but not more. So there really wasn't a need to give back the piece, but Marshall blinked, as I said before. He gave back the piece with bishop into d4. E takes d4 and rook f1. Queen into f1, queen into f1, rook into f1, and king f1. What Marshall probably thought was that this endgame was drawn, but Lasker creates magic in this endgame, as we'll see. First, rook b8, taking control of the semi-open b file, b3, defending the pawn, and rook b5. And we see that black's pieces are going to be much more active than white's pieces. The knight can't move to c3, it'll have to develop on d2, and only then can the a1 rook move. c4, this lets the d pawn be a passed pawn, and if black ever gets in c5, then it will be a protected passed pawn, so it's a positional mistake. He could have tried knight d2, but then rook c5, rook c1, and then bishop a6 check, king f2, and bishop d3, going after the pawn, and of course the pawn is pinned. Knight f3 and rook into c2. Exchanging pawns. Rook into c2, bishop into c2, and knight into d4. White would have some chances. Bishop would grab the e4 pawn and defend the c6 pawn, but knight e6 would go after c7. But then bishop b1, there are chances, although one would favor black, but white might have favored a little better. c4 is a mistake, certainly. And Lasker just plays rook h5. The rook is very active on the 5th rank. It'll harass all the pawns. If h4 here, then g5. And if by any chance you capture, then rook h1. All of white's pieces will be immobilized. The knight will not be able to move at all. And it would be completely lost for white here. So h4 is not really the move to play. So king g1 defending the pawn, and now c5. As we said before, the d4 pawn is now become a protected passed pawn. Very good for black indeed. Knight d2 finally moving out, and king f7. We mobilize the king in the endgame, all sensible. Rook f1 check and king e7. a3, well, perhaps there are ideas of playing b4 and undermining the pawns for black, but rook h6, h4, just defending the pawn and hoping for the king to move, but rook a6. The rook will keep jumping from here to there all across the board. It's a very active rook indeed. And what it does is it keeps provoking small weaknesses from white. Rook to a1 defending, and bishop g4. Not allowing the knight to move to f3, and just keeping a little hold on white's position. King f2 and king e6. a4. If, for instance, knight f3, then bishop into f3, king into f3, and king e5. This is very, very good for black. It's probably winning. White will lose the pawn, and then the d4 pawn is going to be very strong. So a4, but king e5 anyway. King g2. It's not very easy to come up with moves for white. Sorry. King g2 and rook f6. Rook to e1, d3 now. The bishop can even land on e2 if need be. Rook to f1 and king d4. Another benefit of playing d3, the king can infiltrate. Rook takes and g takes. Well, the rook was very active for black, but it's not very important now. The black king is quite dominant right in the center of the board, and there's a pawn on d3 for black. King f2 and c6. Slowly but surely, black will make progress. a5 and a6. White is in zugzwang. You just can't hold everything together. We have a few moves played out. Knight f1, king into e4. King to e1, bishop to e2. Knight d2 check, king e3. Knight to b1, f5. Knight to d2, h5. And we see that white is just making moves because he has to make a move. And black is gaining space. And slowly but surely, white is being paralyzed. Knight b1, king f3. Now the other pawns will go. Knight c3, king into g3. Knight to a4, going after c5 pawn, but f4. There's a second passed pawn here. Knight into c5, f3. Knight e4 check, but king f4. Knight to d6, c5. Not allowing any counterplay from white at all. b4, trying to create some space, but c into b4, a third passed pawn. c5, but b3. Knight to c4 and king g3, and Marshall resigned because the knight has to guard both b2 and d2, and there's already a threat of f2 check, which would force the king to move to d2, and then black will get a queen. There is no move white can make, and we can see for about 20 odd moves white has been completely paralyzed in this game. So very good technique and very good judgment showed by Emanuel Lasker when he evaluated the position over here. over here, when he went in for this endgame and he played rook to b8, he judged the fact that his rook would be tremendously active and that he would be able to force concessions bit by bit from white. That's what makes this game a game so excellent. Well, thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon for the next game.